Let's begin. So tonight we're discussing the gift of dignity. You know, tzedakah in Judaism, of course, is one of the most important mitzvahs. In fact, in these days, in our daily Tanya shir, the morning 20 minutes Tanya lesson, the Alter Rebbe discusses a lot about the meaning of tzedakah, and there's a lot of depth that we can find in tzedakah. We're going to discuss just a few aspects of the concept of tzedakah today. Tzedakah, of course, started with our ancestors. Abraham was a charitable person, was an epitome of kindness, chesed, machnes orech, bringing in guests, and so on. In fact, the word tzedakah in Hebrew, which is charity, really is not translated as charity. Charity is not the proper translation for tzedakah. Tzedakah is more something like righteousness. And why is it? Because when you're talking about charity, it is something that you're doing out of the goodness of your heart. You decide to give, you have, the other person doesn't have, and you want to give him, so out of the goodness of your heart, you give. But when you're talking about righteousness, what you're saying is that really, when God entrusted you, when God gave you what you have, God entrusts you, and He expects you to do the right thing with what He gave you. So by giving tzedakah, in this view, is just an act of righteousness. You're doing the right thing. In this week's Torah portion, the Torah talks about the concept of tzedakah, but this is within the context. The portion, of course, this week is the portion of Re'eh, but this is within the context of the laws of the Shemitah. What is the laws of Shemitah? The seventh year sabbatical that the Jewish people are instructed when they live in Israel. They are not supposed to work in the field. And in this context, the Torah is talking about that you have to support the poor people. And then sometimes people support the poor when they feel comfortable, when they feel financially secured. They don't mind to share some of the wealth. But when it comes a time when it's not so stable, when it comes a time of Shemitah, when the Torah tells you that a whole year you're not supposed to work, a whole year you cannot plant, you cannot do things in the field. At a time like this, it might be more difficult to be open to share. And this is when the Torah says and warns us that to put our trust in Hashem, and especially in time like this, times like when there is difficulties, when you feel not secured, you have to make sure that you do not forget the people in need. Time like a pandemic is also a similar thing. People are not secure; they don't know what's going to be. So the Torah instructs us we should put our trust in Hashem and not to forget the poor. We're gonna see it inside. Let's look inside. So this is from this week's Torah portion. says, if there will be among you a needy person from one of your brothers in one of your cities, in your land, the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not harden your heart, and you shall not close your hand from your needy brother. Rather, you should open your hand to him, and you should lend him sufficient for his needs, which he is lacking. Now the Torah says as follows, be aware, lest there be in your heart an unfaithful thought saying, the seventh year, the year of release, has approached, and you will begrudge your needy brother and not give him, and he will cry out to the Lord against you, and it will be a sin to you. So here the Torah says we have to be careful with this. And in the Torah there is a lot, in the Talmud there is much more. Much of our sages are discussing about the importance of the giving and about the benefits and the special qualities that the mitzvah of tzedakah has, that and the special segulas, remedies, when a person gives tzedakah, what this does. As we see in the next text, Omar Rabbi Yitzchak, Arba dvorim mekarim gzadine shel adam. Rabbi Yitzchak further said, 4 things can cancel a man's fate, namely charity, supplications, change of name, and change of conduct. And charity, as it is written, and charity delivers from death. So we find further, it says about Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, tells us in the Talmud, that when a person gives tzedakah, he has a merit to have children, wise children, rich children, and so on. It says, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said, he who does charity habitually will have sons wise, wealthy, and versed in the Agada. Wise, so he brings wise as it is written, he shall find life. He shall find life. Where do we see wisdom in there, that he should find life? Because wisdom, it says, wisdom brings life, real life. We discussed this also in the last few days in the Tanya. Wealthy as it is written, he shall find righteousness. Versed in Agada. Agada is the part of the Talmud which talks about the mystical part, the stories of the Talmud. As it is written, and he shall find honor, and it is written elsewhere, the wise shall inherit honor. And finally, we find also in the Talmud says about tzedakah that is something that brings the redemption. It has been taught, Rabbi Yehuda said, great is charity in that it brings the redemption nearer. As it says, so says God, keep judgment and do righteousness, tzedakah. For my salvation is near to come and my righteousness to be revealed. So we find in so many places in the Talmud about the greatness of tzedakah. But we want to talk about a little bit more, not just much about the benefit of tzedakah, but we want to focus on another aspect of tzedakah, and that is the aspect of the intention in tzedakah. And this is you see, when it comes to performing mitzvahs, we know in general, a mitzvah, it says, mitzvah is tzriches kavana. Mitzvah needs intention. Kavana means intention. So, to use for example, we have on Rosh Hashanah, we have a mitzvah to blow the shofar, to listen to the sound of the shofar. So when the Rosh Hashanah comes, and let's say you take out the shofar and you decide to play with the shofar, and you happen to make the sounds, not without any intention to actually perform the mitzvah of blowing the shofar or listening to the sound of the shofar. You just happen to make those sounds, and it happens to be the exact same sounds that you're supposed to make in Rosh Hashanah with the shofar, but you did not have any intention. You did not perform the mitzvah. You need to have the kavanah. You need to have the intent. You have to have in mind that I'm doing now the sound, or I'm listening now to the sound of the shofar. Some mitzvahs, this is not so much. So the question is, when it comes to the mitzvah of tzedakah, do we need to have also the intention of having the tzedakah? So let's first see inside what we just mentioned about the kavanah and Rosh Hashanah. This comes from Shulchan Aruch, the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. He says, one does not fulfill the obligation regarding any of the mitzvahs unless the act was performed with the expressed intent of performing the mitzvah. Thus, a person who sounds a shofar as a casual activity for practice has not fulfilled his obligation. Similarly, a person who hears the shofar blast from someone who sounded them as a casual activity. Again, if you pass by in the street and you hear someone sounding the shofar, and you do have in mind that you're doing it, you want to have the mitzvah of listening to the shofar, but it happens to be that a guy who blew the shofar did not intend to do it for the mitzvah, he just played with the shofar. Then also the person who listens, even though the person who listened had in mind the mitzvah, but that didn't help, because the one who blows the shofar also supposed to have the kavanah, the intent. That's what he said. So is using as a casual activity, has not fulfilled his obligation, even if he intended to do so, inasmuch as a person sounding the shofar did not have the required intent. The sounds that were heard were invalid. That's what the Alter Rebbe says. So this principle of mitzvahs tzriches kavanah, that commandments require intentions. So here's the question, what about charity? Do you need kavanah for tzedakah? So we find perhaps a clue in the book of the Mishnah Torah from the Maimonides. The Maimonides write, he makes a statement as follows. Says, let's read it inside. He says, whenever a person gives charity to a poor person with an unpleasant countenance and with his face buried in the earth, he loses and destroys his merit, even if he gives them 1,000 gold pieces. Sometimes it happens. People are giving tzedakah, but they do it with such a not pleasant way that the person, says the Rambam, the Maimonides says here, the person loses all the merits. You can give 1,000 golden coins, you still lose the merits. So this is one source. The question is, does this text that we just read, does it really prove that you need to have intent? That you need to have intent when you give tzedakah? Because when you give tzedakah, tzedakah is something that you give to help somebody else, somebody in need. So when you help someone in need, the question, what is important? Is this the intent important, that important? Or perhaps the fact that you give? You know, there's a story with the Alter Rebbe. There was once a Jew that was an innkeeper, and he was doing very well for himself. He had a lot of money, and he was very charitable, and he was giving tzedakah, was sharing with people. And then one day he came to his Rabbi, the Alter Rebbe, and he said to his Rabbi, Rabbi, I have a dilemma. I don't know what to do. Yeah, what's the problem? He says, Rabbi, you know, every time I give tzedakah, I feel accomplished. And as time goes on, I gain sort of pride, and it gets to the point to I become even arrogant with the fact that I give so much tzedakah. So yes, the Alter Rebbe, maybe, perhaps, you know, it affects I become so unrefined because of the tzedakah. So he says, Rebbe, maybe I should stop giving tzedakah so I become more refined. I do the tzedakah with the wrong intentions. So I'm sure you guessed the answer. The Alter Rebbe told him, absolutely not. You should not stop giving tzedakah. And in fact, the Alter Rebbe told him, perhaps you give it with the wrong intention, but you can be assured that the person who receives the money to feed his family, he receives it with absolutely right intention. So here's the thing. When you give tzedakah, so you're talking about you have the giver and you have the receiver. There is the intent of the giver, but then you have also the receiver. So we find on one way, from the quote that we said from the Maimonides, it seemed like we do need to have the proper intent. If he gives it with a sour face, he loses everything. But yet we can find in other places that it seems that it's a little different. Other sources show us that perhaps it's not so important that what the giver thinks. Let's see in this quote from Deuteronomy, from the Chumash Devarim, the Torah says, when you reap your harvest in your field and forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to take it. It shall be left for the stranger, the orphan, and the widow, so that the Lord your God will bless you in all that you do. Here is an interesting mitzvah. So this is the mitzvah of shikha. Shikha means forgetfulness. That this is a mitzvah for the farmers. That when a farmer works in his field, he has to make sure that if he forgets some of the fruits or whatever he harvests, he doesn't go back to collect it. He has to leave it for the poor. So based on this mitzvah, the Sifri comments, and he says that if a person that loses money and somebody else, a poor man, found the money and he uses it well, then the person who lost the money gets a mitzvah, even though he had no clue that he lost the money. This is what it says here. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said, how do you know that if someone loses a selah, coin, from his hand, and it is found by a pauper, who then benefits from it. The Torah credits him with this mitzvah. It is for this reason the verse states, for the stranger, the orphan, and the widow, so that the Lord your God will bless you in all that you do. It says, now, if one can earn merit, even without intending to do so, and the Torah considers it a worthy act, how much more so when one intends to do something worthy and carries it out. So this is what the Sifri is telling us, that when it comes to tzedakah, it is not so much the importance of the kavanah, the intent. It is the act, the fact that a person receives it, and the fact that a person is being helped. So the question again here, so which way is it? We see on the one hand, we find from the Maimonides that it says that you're not supposed, if you give it with a sour face, you don't get any merits. And on the other hand, we see that mitzvahs do not need intention necessarily. It is also, there's an interesting discussion about the concept of making a bracha. Before every mitzvah that you do, most mitzvahs, almost all mitzvahs, when you do a mitzvah, you say a bracha. You say a blessing, thanking Hashem for doing the mitzvah. But when it comes to the mitzvah of tzedakah, we don't make a bracha. We don't say a bracha, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, asher kadeshanu, blessed are you God that you commanded us in giving charity to the poor. Even though it is a commandment. And we should thank Hashem for this mitzvah, because indeed it is a great mitzvah. It is a great opportunity, it is a great merit for the person who gives the tzedakah. So how come we don't make the bracha? There was one answer I once heard, perhaps half jokingly, is that when if you were going to say that you need to make a bracha before you give tzedakah, then a person who is going to make a bracha is going to say, wait a second, I have to make a bracha, I have to have the proper intention. Oh, wait a second, this morning I didn't use the mikveh, so perhaps I have to go to the mikveh first and purify myself before I perform such a holy mitzvah in giving tzedakah. He's going to run to the mikveh, and he's going to kratz over there in the mikveh, and by the time he's finished with all his preparation for the mitzvah, the poor man is not going to need the tzedakah anymore, if you know what I mean. So that was one way of explaining why we don't make the bracha. But on a more practical note, the Rashba, Rabbi Shlomo ben Aderes, in She'elas Tshuvas, he writes that basically that when you give tzedakah, it is not only about the giver, it is about the recipient. So sometimes it could be that you're going to make a bracha, you're about to give, but then the recipient is not going to take. He's going to change his mind for whatever reason. Let's see what the Rashba says. He says, we do not recite a blessing on a mitzvah whose fulfillment is beyond one's own control. For if the fulfillment of the mitzvah is dependent on another person, it is possible that a person will not be satisfied, thereby rendering the action void. For example, the mitzvah of giving a gift to the poor, or lending to the needy, or giving charity, or bequeathing, giving. This is a special mitzvah of giving. After you free a slave, you have to give them severance pay, and so on. So basically, any mitzvah that involves a recipient, it's not up to you, it's beyond your control, then you cannot make a bracha because you don't know if the person will receive it. And we know when you say a bracha, you're using God's name, and it is absolutely a serious thing to use God's name in vain. Use God's name in vain is something very serious we're not supposed to use. And therefore, you can't just use God's name and make a bracha because you don't know. Maybe that person has changed his mind. Okay, I'm sorry, I don't want to take tzedakah. Okay, I decide I want to do it on my own. So whatever reason, so that's why it says we don't make the bracha. Now, so we said that we found something, one thing when the Maimonides said, that it seemed that we need to have the proper kavanah. And the other things we found from different sources that seem that kavanah, the intent, is not as important. But what is most interesting is that we find the Rambam himself, the Maimonides himself, writes something that seems to be contradicting. The Rambam, the Maimonides, writes about different levels in tzedakah, how one gives tzedakah. And we're going to look inside. Let's look inside, see how the Rambam writes this. Shmoina ma'alos yesh b'tzedakah zu l'mayla mizu. Says there are 8 levels in charity, each level surpassing the other. The highest level, beyond which there is none, is a person who supports a Jew who has fallen into poverty by giving him a present or a loan, entering into partnership with him, or finding him work so that his hand will be fortified, so that he will not have to ask others for alms. Concerning this, the verse states, you should support him, the stranger, the resident, and he shall live among you. Implied is that you should support him before he falls and becomes needy. Like the saying goes, rather than giving the poor man a fish, you got to teach him how to fish. Let him have his sustenance in dignity. So that, says the Rambam, this is the highest level possible to help a person, to be charitable, is to help him find a job, to give him, become partners with him, and help him to build himself up financially. Then he goes to the next level. He goes from the top down. A lower level than this is one who gives charity to the poor without knowing to whom he gave and without the poor person knowing from whom he received. It's called matan b'seisa. There's a special box. You put it into the box, and nobody knows where it goes. And the poor person takes it, and he doesn't know where it came from. Then it says the next level, a lower level than that is an instant when the giver knows to whom he's giving, but the poor person does not know from whom he received. A lower level than that is an instant where a poor person knows from whom he took, but the donor does not know to whom he gave. A lower level than that is giving the poor person in his hand before he asked. When you know someone needs, and you don't wait for him to come to you to beg, please give me. But you know he needs, and you go ahead and you give him before he asks. And then a lower level than that is giving him after he asks. The lower level than this is giving him less than what is appropriate, but with a pleasant countenance. In other words, you can give more, but you give less. But whatever you give with a nice face. And finally, the lowest level of all them, says the Rambam, a lower level is giving him with sadness. When you give the person with a sad face, that is the lowest level of giving tzedakah. So, is that a problem with what we said earlier? It seems like it's a total contradiction. Before the Maimonides, we quoted from the Maimonides that when you give with sadness, when you give in a sour face, you lose everything. And here, the Rambam says that when you give with sadness, it is still considered giving tzedakah. Because you're giving, in the end of the day, you're giving it, so you give. He lists it among the levels of giving tzedakah. That means that he is receiving the reward, or is it considered that he gave tzedakah? He doesn't lose everything. So what is the explanation? So here there's an explanation given by the Shach, the Sifsei Cohen, Rabbi Shapsei ben Meir Cohen. He writes as follows. He says, giving with sadness, while he may be upset about giving, at the very least, it doesn't display a fraud. That is the difference. If it does, it is not considered one of the 8 levels, since he has lost his merit altogether, and he transgresses the prohibition of giving with aggrievement. So basically what the Shach explains is that when he differentiates between when you give tzedakah and you're sad within yourself. If you're sad within yourself, but you still give him is okay. It is the lowest level of giving tzedakah. But when you show someone else, when you show the person that you give him and that makes him feel bad, that, says the Rambam, then you lose all merits of even if you gave him $1,000. But if you give him and you show it to the person that you feel bad about it, you're giving it, reluctantly, then it loses the whole effect of the giving tzedakah. So the question we can ask, what is exactly the Rambam? We list 8 levels of giving tzedakah from the Rambam, the Maimonides. But what qualifies the different levels? What makes one level less or more than the other level? So if we'd have to ask you, charity, to finish the sentence, charity is best when it's done with what? When it's done with blank. Charity is best when it's done with, you can say, good heart, generosity. But here the Rambam would say that the charity is best when it's done with dignity. When it's done with dignity, this seems to be the ultimate ranking that the Maimonides ranks the levels of charity, is how dignified you make the person feel. And that is the levels, if you think about this. So when you give him a job, that's the ultimate dignity. The person feels good about himself. Is helping himself. In fact, this is one of the things, and obviously when you go down the level, the lower the level is, the less dignity the recipient has. We do in the Birkas Hamazon, when we eat, we do the grace for the meal, we ask from Hashem this exact thing. He says this is part of the grace of the meal. He says, tend us, nourish us, sustain us, feed us, and provide us with plenty And speedily, Lord our God, grant us relief from all of our afflictions. Lord our God, please do not make us dependent upon the gifts of mortal men or upon the loans, but only upon your full, open, holy, and generous hand, that we may never be shamed or disgraced. That's what we're talking about. Talking about the dignity. When you give a person with dignity, this is the ultimate way of helping a person. Now, so when you're talking about giving and giving with dignity, then you're bringing in the recipient. It's not about you. So the difference is when we're talking about having kavanah, having intent, it's about the person who's giving. But when we're talking about a tzedakah, is when you feel the pain of the person who needs it. Because after all, God created this world in that way, that there is a giver and there is a recipient. And the whole reason why God created it that way is in order to enable us to act godly by giving. So in a way, the person who receives, in a way, may be even greater than the person who gives. When you give someone, when a person receives and you receive, it says when you give tzedakah, obviously you have to have the right intent. But there's also law, it says when you receive tzedakah, you also have to have the right intent. What is the right intent? The right intent is that Hashem put you in this position, and now you are enabling someone else to act with the act as a giver, and act with an act of kindness. But tzedakah doesn't only mean that when you give something, you give with a smile. That is obviously the ultimate way of giving tzedakah. You give it with a smile. But not only giving with a smile, but giving a smile itself is also tzedakah. When you help someone in need of a nice encouragement, with good advice, with feeling, with empathy, this is the giving. This is the giving with dignity. Interestingly, the Rabbi says that, that sometimes he's talking about the people when they left Egypt, the Jewish people, they all were wealthy. It says they all came out from Egypt with all the spoils, with all the gold, the silver, the jewelry, and everything. Each and every one had full. And obviously, in the beginning, they didn't lose it that quickly. Yes, later on, people became poor, but in the beginning, everybody was rich. How did they then perform the mitzvah of charity? If everybody's rich, how could they perform the mitzvah of charity? Says the Rebbe here something very interesting. He says, obviously, even when one encounters a fellow Jew who lacks nothing materially or spiritually, it's possible to perform charity by greeting him with a smile, or even an actual deed by inviting him to be your guest, to offer him something to eat, drink, or a place to stay. In fact, as the Jewish people were preparing to receive the Torah after leaving Egypt, this was the form their charity took. After leaving Egypt, every Jew had whatever they needed. More than that, they were wealthy, as the rabbinic literature relates, with regards to the tremendous amount of gold and silver the Jewish people took as spoils from Egypt, and especially from after the splitting of the sea. Undoubtedly, by the time the Jews received the Torah, it was not possible for anyone, even if they had wanted, to have squandered all that wealth in such short time. It took only, 49 days since they left Egypt. Which begs the question, how did they observe the mitzvah of giving charity when not a single one of them needed anything. We are compelled to say that they fulfill the mitzvah of charity by giving, not by giving money, but by showing each other pleasant demeanor. Maybe this is why the Jewish people then, it says they were ke'ish echad belev echad. They were like one man in one heart. It seems like most fights come because of money, right? And there, that's obviously it's a humorous comment, but there people had no problems with money, so they had no problems. There was ke'ish echad belev echad. They all were united as one. So this is what the Rebbe concludes here. He says, what is the giving? The giving with good countenance, says the Rebbe. This is one way to explain why one should give charity with a pleasant countenance. After all, since extending support to the poor person and his family, of what import is the pleasant countenance? Certainly, displaying a frown while giving charity is to be condemned, since quite obviously it can cause embarrassment and so on. But what imperative is there to give with a smile? The explanation is that giving charity with a smile is a way to show solidarity and to emphasize that the giver realizes that he is also receiving something from the poor person. Since if not for the recipient, he would not be able to fulfill the mitzvah of charity. Just yesterday, someone commented to me. He said he has a friend who is getting close to religion, but he was very disturbed by the fact that people come and they come to shul and they ask for charity, they ask for money, and he thinks religion is all about money. And he explained to them, wait a second, think about it. This is the person who comes asking for charity is giving us an opportunity to do this great mitzvah. The mitzvah of charity, to share with yours to someone else, is the most godly thing you can do. And this is, in fact, what we study in this last week or so, in the morning class, in the Tanya class, where one of the things the Alter Rebbe says is that there is certain things that God obviously is in much, much higher level than we are, and we cannot achieve this closeness, the level of connection with godliness on our own, because we are humans, we are limited, we are finite. And the only way that a person is able to reach closer to Hashem is through the acts of charity. Why? Because doing charity is doing exactly what God is doing. It says God works measure for measure. God shares from him to the undeserving. Everything what Hashem gives is something which we do not deserve. Hashem gives out of his goodness. And therefore, when we act in a similar fashion, when we act towards others in a similar fashion and giving to someone that didn't work for it, but we worked for it, we earned it, or we inherited it, whatever, but we give it to someone else, someone in need, this is a godly act. And when you do the godly act, and that itself brings you closer and brings you the connection to Hashem. So may Hashem help and the schus, the merit of the mitzvah of tzedakah. And that says that tzedakah mekareves geula, brings the redemption closer. We see the Rebbe always encourage people to give tzedakah, to put pushkas in the houses, to put wherever you can. But a tzedakah, as we said here also, is not just with the money. The tzedakah is the giving of the dignity, giving the friendship, giving a smile. All of this will bring the Mashiach very soon. Let us hope we should be zeicher very soon. Thank you for joining. If you have any questions, you can ask the questions. And tomorrow morning again, we have the Tanya class, 9 o'clock at the same time.